Hello and welcome to BYJU'S. One of the serious environment problem the present world facing is the global warming. And this global warming is responsible for affecting all sectors of economy, maybe the developed country or the developing countries. It affects the productivity of the flora as well as the fauna. The effort has been done to keep the global temperature of this century 2 degrees centigrade less than what it was having in the pre-industrial era, and if possible, keeping it up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in this view, COP21, that is a Paris Agreement of 2015, is very significant. While adopting Paris Agreement, UNFCC, that is United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, invited IPCC to provide a special report, and on the invitation of UNFCC, IPCC has submitted its special report, and among the series of report, one report was submitted in the month of October 2018. So in this video, we will be discussing about the special report of IPCC, which was submitted in the month of October. Before discussing about the reports, we have to understand something called as global warming. And to understand global warming, basic information is also very significant to be understood. And after understanding the global warming perspectives, we'll make an effort to understand the highlight of IPCC report, which is called as the special report. And then at the last, we'll conclude the session by knowing about the impacts or the effects of global warming. The sun is the ultimate source of energy for the earth. And in case of the sun and earth parameters, the energy released by the sun, which is referred as an electromagnetic radiation, is referred as insolation. And this insolation, a part of which reaches to the earth, it heats up the earth's surface, and after heating the earth's surface, it is reflected back by the earth. And this radiation, which is reflected back by the earth, is referred as the terrestrial radiation. So the incoming solar radiations are known as insolation. The outgoing radiations, which are reflected back by the earth, is referred as the terrestrial radiation. Now, temperature defines the nature of the wavelengths. So in general, we find there is a relation between temperature, frequency, and the wavelength, what it is released. We find that the temperature is directly proportional to frequency, and this frequency is inversely proportional to wavelength. So it means that if the temperature of an emitting body is high, in that case, the wavelengths which are released by that body will be of short waves. So that is inverse relation between temperature and the wavelength. So the emitting body or the temperature defines the nature of wavelength, we say. So as the temperature of the sun is comparatively very high, so the insolations or the radiations emitted by the sun are in the form of short waves. And as the temperature of an earth is comparatively less, so when we talk about the average temperature, it is around, say, 20 degrees centigrade. So the radiations which are reflected back by the earth are in the form of long waves. So we can say insolation is of short waves and the terrestrial radiation is the long waves. Now, what has to be there in case of these relations? Now, when we talk about the atmosphere which is found on the surface of an earth, this atmosphere is transparent for the short waves, and the same atmosphere, it becomes opaque in case of the long waves. It means that here the atmosphere absorbs the radiations which are emitted by terrestrial radiations. or the Earth. So because of which the atmosphere is heated by the terrestrial radiation more than the insolation. So that's why we find the highest temperature of an Earth is recorded somewhere in between 2 to 3 p.m. The composition of atmosphere. Now when we say atmosphere is nothing, it is an envelope of gas which surrounds the Earth's surface, and it is attached to the Earth because of the gravitational force of the Earth which pulls these gases. So the effective atmosphere is found very near to the Earth's surface. And this atmosphere is very significant because the ideal composition of atmosphere is necessary for sustaining the life on the Earth. So it has a mechanism which helps in sustaining the life. For example, absorption of ultraviolet radiations in the ozone layer, and the gases like carbon dioxide, which are the best absorber of heat. So optimum amount of carbon dioxide is a necessity to maintain the temperature which can sustain the life, which can help in flourishing the flora and fauna. Oxygen supports the life, combustion. So we find this atmosphere is very significant in sustaining the life. Now this atmosphere, the composition of atmosphere, what we say, is responsible for maintaining the global warming or the temperature of an Earth into an ideal conditions. If the composition of the atmosphere alters, it makes an impact on the climatic conditions on the Earth's surfaces also. Now, when we talk about the atmosphere, it consists of the gases which are called as the permanent gases, or they are also referred as the fixed gases, whose proportion is ideally fixed. For example, nitrogen, whose proportion is fixed, oxygen, whose proportion is fixed, carbon dioxide, whose proportion is fixed. Along with that, we also have the gases which are referred as the variable gases. For example, water vapor, which is highly variable gas. It is highest in case of the surface of oceans, and it is almost all zero in the desert areas. So highly variable component is water vapor. Now, when we talk about the composition of an atmosphere, here we find in the recent years, or maybe from 20th century and the beginning of 21st century, we find that the anthropogenic factors are responsible for making an impact on the composition of atmosphere. For example, when we talk about the carbon dioxide, this carbon dioxide was somewhere around 280 parts per million at the phase or at an era of industrial revolution. Now, when we talk about the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the year 2018, it has crossed 400 parts per million. So we find that the composition of an atmosphere is very significant in defining the climatic conditions of that area. Now, along with the gases, we also find aerosols. So these aerosols are nothing but the suspension of solid and liquid particles. Now, some of these aerosols, they are hygroscopic in nature. Now, this hygroscopic nature of an aerosols makes them to form what we call it as the nuclei of condensation. Nuclei of condensation. And this nuclei of condensation is responsible for formation of the clouds. And these aerosols in the atmosphere, they scatter, absorb both short waves as well as the long waves. And when you talk about these aerosols are released by the natural process, and they are also released by man-made, which we call them as an anthropogenic process. In case of anthropogenic process, the industries, the fossil fuels are responsible for emitting these aerosols. Now, high temperature combustion in the atmosphere releases an aerosol which we call it as the black carbon. And the organic combustion in the atmosphere is responsible for releasing what we call it as brown carbon. Now, this black carbon and brown carbon are very significant in defining the parameters of the increasing temperature of an earth, which we call it as the global warming. So these carbons, that is black carbon and brown carbon, they have the tendency of absorbing more amount of heat, that is the terrestrial radiations, by which the average temperature of the surface of an earth is increasing. Among the gases, we come across a category of gases which are referred as the greenhouse gases. These may be the primary greenhouse gases or the secondary greenhouse gases, which are formed by the chemical reactions between the different organic components and the gases. Now, these greenhouse gases, they are having the property of absorbing infrared radiations emitted from the earth. Now, when the earth emits the radiations, which we call them as the terrestrial radiations, which are having the wavelengths which are longer. So long wavelength radiations are referred as infrared radiations, which are emitted by the earth. And these greenhouse gases, they absorb these radiations which are reflected from the surface, and they re-radiate back to the earth's surface, by which they are responsible for making an impact on the temperature. And when you talk about the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide is considered as the major greenhouse gas. Along with that, methane is also considered as a greenhouse gas. This methane is released in the atmosphere through the paddy fields, that is rice cultivation fields, and also from the swamps and some of the areas where we find the flora or the green plants which are submerged in the water bodies. So they release the methane gases. Along with that, nitrous oxide is also significant in defining the parameters of greenhouse gas. Including these, we find water vapor, which is also considered as the greenhouse. So we can say that the greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere are responsible for absorbing the terrestrial radiations of the Earth. And these greenhouse gases, when we say carbon dioxide is the abundant of these greenhouse gases. Now, the global greenhouse gas emission by the economic sectors, different economical activities which are performed on the earth, where we find that they are responsible for releasing these gases, which we call it as the greenhouse gases. Among these, we find that electricity and the heat production releases 25% of the greenhouse gases. Agriculture, forestry, and the other land use releases 24%. Transportation releases 14%. Industry releases 21%. Buildings releases 6% of the greenhouse gases. So these are the economic sectors, that is transportation, agriculture, industries, which are responsible for releasing up of the greenhouse gases. Heat budget and albedo. Now, what is this heat budget? Heat budget explains the amount of energy or heat which is received from the sun, or which we call it as an insolation. And part of this insolation is used by atmosphere. And part of that is reflected back by the atmosphere. And part of that reaches to the earth. And again, it is reflected back by the earth. So in general, when we talk about the heat budget, it explains about the amount of insolation received by the sun and the total amount of energy or radiations which are reflected by the earth system. So when we say earth system, it includes the atmosphere and the surface of an earth. Now, when there is a balance between the insolation and the energy which is released back by the earth system, then we find the temperature of an earth remains same or maintains the ideal temperature for a longer period of a time. So this optimum temperature which is maintained on the surface of an earth because of the balancing of the incoming insolation and the emission of the radiations from the earth system, when it is balanced, so that phenomenon is referred as radiative equilibrium of the earth. Now, if more amount of absorption is done, this more amount of absorption is responsible for making an impact on heating of the atmosphere. And if more amount of radiation is reflected back, so if there is more amount of reflection from the Earth system, then in that case, we find that the temperature of the surface of an Earth decreases. So it means that this phenomenon is responsible for something which we call it as diminishing or decreasing the temperature. So remember, if there is more absorption, the average temperature of Earth increases. If there is more amount of reflection from the Earth system, then it is responsible for decreasing the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. Now, in defining the heat budget, we use the term called as albedo. Albedo is amount of insolation which is reflected back either by the clouds or by atmosphere or by the ice which is found on the Earth's surface. So this radiations which is reflected back either by clouds, atmosphere or the ice cap before reaching to the Earth's surface is referred as an albedo. So albedo is the reflected insolation before reaching to the Earth surface either by clouds, atmosphere or the ice cap. So in general, when we talk about an albedo of an Earth is seen somewhere between 30% to 35%. So in the last decade, the average albedo, when they made a calculation, it was found somewhere around 33%. Now, what is the significance of albedo on the climate or the heating impact? Now, if this albedo decreases, in this case, more amount of solar radiations or insolation will reach to the Earth and more amount of heating takes place on the Earth's surfaces. So whenever there is an albedo which is decreasing, it makes more amount of penetration of the solar radiation to the Earth's surface. Now we find that the albedo of an Earth has decreased from 35 to 30. So it means that more amount of insolation is penetrating to the Earth, and this extra is responsible for heating the Earth's atmosphere more. So there is a direct relation between albedo and the heating impact of the atmosphere. Remember, if albedo decreases, more penetration of insolation or incoming solar radiations which heats up the terrestrial radiation more. At this stage, we know that the atmosphere on the Earth's surface is opaque for the terrestrial radiation and it is transparent for the insolation, that is incoming solar radiation. Now these terrestrial radiations which are emitted back by the Earth's surfaces, they are in the form of long waves. And these long waves are absorbed in the Earth's atmosphere, more specifically by the greenhouse gas. And this phenomenon of absorption of the terrestrial radiations by the greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere is referred as greenhouse. And this absorption is responsible for increasing the temperature of an Earth over a period of a time because of the anthropogenic factors and increasing of the aerosols, more specifically the brown carbon and the black carbon, and more burning up of the fossil fuels. We find the concentration of greenhouse gases has increased such a high that the greenhouse effect or the absorbing capacity is also increased. So because of more amount of greenhouse effect, more amount of absorption of the terrestrial radiation, the surface of an Earth is increasing in the temperature. So this phenomenon of increasing temperature of an Earth, the average temperature of an Earth, is referred as the global warming. Now, the two main reasons are considered as the factors for increasing the global warming. One is the decrease in the albedo, and second one is the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases. So these two are responsible for increasing the average temperature of an Earth. which is referred as the global warming. Now, they identified that this global warming is making an adverse effect on the productivity of the flora and fauna, and also on the different economies. May not be directly, but indirectly they are affecting. So a systematic approach was started in the regard of the global warming. And the first perspective in general we can say is the Stockholm Conference of 1972. So this Stockholm Conference secured the permanent place for environment on the world's agenda. So it highlighted the impact of the environment in the world agenda. And at the same time in the Stockholm Conference, it made a setting up of United Nations Environment Program, headquartered in Nairobi, that is in Kenya. And two persons are significant in setting this United Nations Environment Program. One is Wangari Maathai and Maurice Strong. Now, the second step towards the global warming issue is the Brundtland Commission of 1983, which is also referred as the World Commission on Environment and Development. And this Brundtland Commission submitted a report, and the report is named as the Our Common Future in the year 1987. This report highlighted the significance of environment in the socio-economic growth. And along with the report, this Brundtland Commission highlighted the concept of what we call it as the sustainable development. So here the sustainable development talks about environment protection, agriculture aspect. It also talks about the poverty and its reduction. So it takes all the aspect of sustainable development which are reflected in this arena. Now the third one is very significant, which is referred as the Earth Summit, which was in the year 1992. It is also referred as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. So this conference was in the place called as Rio. So that's why it is also referred as Rio Summit. The outcome of the Earth Summits are the three conventions. The first one is United Nations Framework on Convention of the Climate Change. This UNFCCC is an intergovernmental treaty developed to address the problem of the climate change. And the parties who signed this UNFCCC are referred as the Conference of Parties. And these parties, they started meeting annually from 1991. These Conference of Parties, that is the nations which are signatory to UNFCCC, annually they meet since from 1995, which is referred as the Conference of Parties 1. So the parties to United Nations Framework on Convention of Climate Change, they meet every year, which is referred as Conference of Parties since from 1995. And the second one is the Convention on Biological Diversities. So here, these parties which have signed are referred as the Conference of Parties to Convention on Biological Diversities. So these meet once in 2 years to address or to understand the issues concerned with the biological diversity. Along with that, the third convention was regarding the combat of the desertification. So along with these three conventions, it also said something which is referred as Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is the blueprint of sustainable development of the 21st century. So here 21 refers to the 21st century and agenda is the sustainable development. So Agenda 21 is a blueprint of sustainable development of the 21st century. Now what is this IPCC report? Now before highlighting or understanding the IPCC report, what is this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or what is this IPCC? Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was formed in the year 1983 by two organizations. World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environment for Program. And this is an international body for assessing science related to climate change. And it provides regular assessment to the policymakers regarding the climate change, its impact, risk, and the option for adaptation and mitigation the same. Now, since from its formation, IPCC has submitted the reports, which we refer them as an assessment reports. They are very significant in adapting the measures in the purview of global warming and the climate changes also. And these are very significant for the policymakers, and all the international conventions or any nations, they always depend on the report submitted by IPCC. And on the basis of those reports, the blueprints of the developments or the blueprints of the combating the climate change is done. Now, it has given or it has submitted 5 of its reports, which we call them as the assessment reports. The first was in the year 1990. And this first assessment report highlighted the formation of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. On the recommendation of the first assessment, this UNFCC was formed in Rio Summit, or it is also called as the Earth Summit. Now, the second assessment report was in the year 1995. This assessment report highlighted regarding the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol. The third assessment was in the year 2001, and this report highlighted the role of anthropogenic factors. It means human-induced greenhouse gases which increased in the atmosphere, maybe due to usage of the fossil fuels, industries. So all these anthropogenic factors are responsible for increasing the concentration of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which was very much highlighted in the third assessment report. The fourth assessment report was in the year 2007. This was very significant because it created a greater attention for the integration of climate change with the sustainable development policies and the relation between mitigation and the adaptation. So because of its approach in the year 2007, IPCC received a Nobel Prize also. The fifth assessment report of IPCC is very, very significant, and this report was submitted in the year 2013 and 14. And this report highlighted the human influence of the climate system is very clear. It means that the anthropogenic factors or human-induced factors are very much significant in the climate change. That is, the global warming is clear. And more we disrupt our climate, more risks are seen. So because of that, we find the intensity of droughts, intensity of floods, all have increased. It means that if we disrupt the climate, more disasters, more risks are seen on the Earth's surface. Then it also said that we have means to limit the climatic change and build a more prosperous, sustainable future. Along with these, it also made a significant aspect of identifying the bulk of greenhouse gases between 2000 and 2010 was from energy sector, industry, transport, and building. So it highlighted the energy sector, industry, transports, and the building in the contribution of greenhouse gases. And more specifically, it says that energy sector provides 47% of the greenhouse contribution, industry provided 30% of greenhouse gases, transport provides 11%, and the building construction provide 3% of the greenhouse gases. So these greenhouse gases are responsible for increasing the greenhouse effect or absorption of the terrestrial radiation, which in turn is responsible for increasing the average temperature of an Earth, which we call it as the global warming. In the year 2015, when Paris Agreement was adopted, UNFCCC United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it invited IPCC to provide a special report. And on the invitation of UNFCCC, IPCC has created 3 special reports. And the first report was submitted in the year October 2018. And the report is global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the second report will be submitted in the year 2019, August. And this report, or the special report of 2019, will highlight the impact of climate change on the land, more specifically desertification and sustainable development and sustainable management. So this is the second report in the series, which will be in the year 2019. And the third will be in the month of September 2019. So this third in the series highlights the significance of climate change on ocean and the cryosphere. Now, what is this cryosphere? Cryosphere is the region of an earth where temperature is very low. Cryo means low. So the ice deposited areas in the earth surface are referred as the cryosphere. They are more specifically referred as the tundra. So when we talk about the cryosphere of an earth, we find the ice deposits are found in the 2 poles, that is North Pole and the South Pole, Arctic, Antarctic, and along with that, they are also found at higher altitudes like Himalayas. So these regions of higher altitudes in the Himalayas are referred as alpine tundra, and those which are found at the poles, northern pole and the southern poles, are referred as the polar tundras. So this region of an earth where the deposition of ice is seen is referred as the cryosphere. So the third report is very significant, which gives what is the significance or what is the impact of the climate or increasing temperature on the oceans as well as this cryosphere. Now, the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is the first report which was submitted in the month of October. Now, before understanding this, Paris Agreement of 2015. So the Paris Agreement says that keeping the global temperature rise this century below 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level and making or pursuing effort to limit this to 1.5 degrees Celsius. On the Paris Agreement, when it was adopted, it also highlighted individual countries' contribution or their blueprints in mitigating the climate change impact also, which are referred as the National Determined Contributions, NDC. So while adopting the Paris Agreement, it invited IPCC for making the reports, which are called as the special reports. What will be the impact of the average increase of the temperature of 1.5 degrees centigrade rather than 2 degrees centigrade? So this aspect was highlighted in the special report. And on the invitation of the UNFCCC, the reports were submitted. Now, 91 authors and the review auditors from the 40 countries worked towards this report. And when we talk about this report, it highlighted the climatic change impact that could be avoided by limiting the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 2 degrees Celsius or more. It means that what will be the impact of the global warming if the average temperature of an earth increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial era. Now, this is very significant because at present, the average global temperature has already exceeded 1 degree centigrade. And some of the countries like India, it has exceeded 1.2 degrees centigrade. So it means that already we have crossed the barrier of 1 degree centigrade compared to the pre-industrial era. So that's why what precautionary measures has to be taken, what significant steps which can be taken so that we can reduce the impact of the 2 degrees centigrade is the outcome of this report. And this report was approved at Incheon, South Korea. Now, North Korea and South Korea, these two countries are separated by a line which is called as the 38th parallel line. So here we can say 38th parallel line demarcates North Korea from South Korea, and the region is also referred as demilitarization zone, and Incheon is in South Korea. Now this report is also very significant for the COP24, which will be there in Katowice in the year 2018, that is December. So here it provides key inputs when government reviews the Paris Agreement to tackle climate. Now this Katowice is in Poland, where COP24, that is the 24th edition of Conference of Parties, is held, and this is the Katowice region. So Katowice is in Poland. Now this special report highlighted the climate change impacts that could be avoided if we limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius than 2 degrees Celsius. Now what are the impacts when we make it to 1.5 degree, or when we keep the global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius rather than keeping it to 2 degrees Celsius? The first one is the global sea level. If we keep the global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, then the average sea level will be 10 centimeters less compared to 2 degrees centigrades. Now the second is seen in case of corals. Now corals are very significant in the ecosystems. The corals are referred as the foundation species because the reefs which are formed provides shelter for the different marine organisms. So that's why these corals are rich in biodiversity. So they are very significant ecologically. So that's why corals are referred as the foundation species, which protects the biodiversity, or which provides shelter for the marine organisms in their reefs. Along with that, these corals, they are also referred as an indicator species. Now, when we talk about the corals, these corals, they have a symbiotic relationship between an algae, zooxanthellae. And this algae, zooxanthellae, provides coral with food and the color. So this symbiotic relation is very significant for maintaining the life of a coral and its color. Now, when we talk about the stress, that is, if the global temperature increases, if the concentration of carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, majority of this carbon dioxide is absorbed in the ocean. So this absorbed carbon dioxide in the ocean increases the temperature of the ocean water, which we call it as the stress due to temperature. Now this temperature is responsible for destructing the symbiotic relation between the coral and the algae. Now when this symbiotic relation is disturbed, the zooxanthellae algae leaves the corals, withers the corals. So this prospect of leaving the coral is referred as coral bleaching. And if the bleaching is continued for a longer period of a time, in that case, the coral will die. So bleaching is not the death of a coral. If the bleaching is continued, if the stress is continued for a longer period of a time, it is responsible for the death of the coral. So these polyps or corals which stay in the colonies, they always maintain the symbiotic relationship with the zooxanthellae algae. And this symbiotic relation is very significant for maintaining the life of the corals. Now, in this report, it says that if the global temperature is maintained at 1.5 degree centigrade, then 70 to 90% of the corals will get destroyed. And if the global temperature, average temperature reaches to 2 degrees centigrade, or if we control the temperature or the efforts to control the temperature up to 2 degrees centigrade. So in that case, most of the corals or all the corals will die. So it has made a significant impact on the corals. They provide an indication about the global warming. So that's why they are referred as an indicator species. Now, the third one is the Arctic Ocean. Now, if the temperature is maintained at 1.5 degrees centigrade, the average global temperature, then the free ice in the summer, that is the melting up of the ice in the Arctic Ocean, will be once in the century. And if the temperature is maintained at 2 degrees centigrade, and if we make an effort to maintain the 2 degree centigrade temperature, so in that case, the melting of the ice or freeing up of the ices we see in every decade. So every 10 years once we find the free of ice or melting up of glacier is seen in case of Arctic Ocean. So these are the three major things which are highlighted by the special report. One is sea level, second one is on the coral, third one is the Arctic Ocean. And in its report, that is special report, it said that carbon dioxide is the major culprit for all the global warming. So as it has highlighted the carbon dioxide, or it considered the carbon dioxide as the major culprit, so this carbon dioxide is emitted more by anthropogenic factors, maybe by the burning up of the fossil fuels or the different aspects associated with the human activities. And it says that the global net human caused emission of carbon dioxide need to fall at 45% from the 2010 levels. It should reach to zero around 2050. And the second one is use of coal as an electricity source would have to be dropped from nearly 40% today to around 5% in the future. So it means that the alternative source of energy should be developed rather than highlighting the coal. Coal is used in generation of thermal energy. So we should emphasize on renewable energy sources. As in case of this, already we find the moves have been done. As in case of India, the International Solar Alliance was formed for harnessing the solar energy. So we find many developments are being, but they have to be brought into systematic execution so that the use of coal in developing the electricity should be reduced. Now, the impact of global warming on oceans. So in case of ocean, we find the ocean acidification is the major cause. Second, it impacts on the salinity of ocean water. Now, when we talk about the impact on the salinity, so this salinity is responsible for changing the ocean currents. So in the oceans, the impact of the global warming is acidification and salinity, which affects the ocean currents. Second is precipitation. It has affected not only the types of precipitation, even the forms of precipitation also. In the northern hemisphere, when we talk about the Arctic, more amount of precipitation is in the form of snow or ice. Now, because of increasing the temperature, we find the precipitation is in the form of rainfall, that is raindrop, liquid water. Now, this rainfall or the water is responsible for making a change in the albedo there. Because when we talk about ice, the ice is having an albedo which is around 90%. And the albedo of water is comparatively less. So when the precipitation is there in the form of water, more amount of insolation penetrates the surface of an ice, and this is responsible for melting of the ice in the Arctic region, and it creates the water bodies rather than the ice. So such ponds or such water bodies which are found in the Arctic regions are referred as melt ponds. And when the melt ponds are formed, more insolation penetrates, because of decreased albedo, it accelerates the melting up of the glacier in that region. Now, with increasing temperature, we find the melting up of glacier is seen, which is a direct impact of the global warming. Now, agriculture and economy is also affected by global warming. In case of agriculture, yields of many crops decreases due to increasing temperature. And when we talk about the increasing temperature, in case of India, for example, the average temperature has increased to 1.2 degrees centigrade compared to the pre-industrial era. With this increase of 1.2 degrees centigrade, every year we are losing 1% of the GDP. The global warming also affects the environment and the biodiversity. The productivity decreases. So that's why it makes impacts on the marine biodiversity, the terrestrial biodiversity, and also the wetland biodiversity also. This global warming is responsible for changing the weathers. So because of that, suddenly we find precipitation is found in one region. Heat waves have increased in the northern hemisphere and in different parts of the earth. So the weather conditions which have been changed due to impact of the global warming are seen in one way or other way, either in maybe with reference to the rainfall pattern, heat waves, the cold waves which are seen, and this affects the health of the human beings also. So directly this health will impact the socio-economic parameters of the society. Now, with the depletion of the yield, it creates an impact on the food resources, that is scarcity of the food resources, and the security of food is also questioned if the global warming continues in the same way. Without any efforts, if we continue the same perspectives, then it will create a great impact on the food security also. Because of the impact of the global warming, we find that there has been a significant change in what we call it as an El Nino and La Nina. So this El Nino and La Nina are responsible for changing the impact on the monsoons. Now, when we talk about the monsoon is very significant in case of India. Recently, when we talk about the Kerala floods, due to the variation in the temperature parameters, we find a strong Somali jet stream was responsible for increasing the moisture-laden winds towards the Western Ghats. And again, due to global warming and the impacts are seen in decreasing the low depressions in case of India, that is more specifically Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea. So these low depressions which are decreased are responsible for concentrating the winds or the monsoon in one particular area. So because of the decreased low depressions, we find that accumulation of the moisture or the wind takes place, which impacts heavy precipitation in one region and reduces the precipitation in the different areas. So the bottom line is, more the depressions are found in the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. So these low depressions are responsible for uniform distribution of the monsoon. Now, because of global warming, as the low depressions are decreased, we find a mechanism of concentrating of the monsoon wind in one region and deficiency of precipitation in other region. Now, this global warming is also significant in defining the cyclones in Indian Ocean. More specifically, when we talk about the cyclones in the Indian Ocean, we find that the number of cyclones in the Bay of Bengal is more, and the number of cyclones in the Arabian Sea are in general very less. A systematic report has been developed, and according to the report, they say that the global warming is responsible for increasing the severe cyclones in the Arabian Sea and decreasing tendency of the cyclones in Bay of Bengal. It is very significant in case of Indian parameters. Now, when the human interference are seen in increasing the global warming, now the scientists are making an effort to define a parameter to end what we call it as a Holocene epoch, and with the interference of human beings, that is anthropogenic factors, which is responsible for increasing the climate change and global warming. Since from 1950s, they are referring this to be something which we call it as an Anthropocene epoch. Anthropocene refers to the human-induced change. Now, the worrying factor is if the same thing is continued, if the same parameters are continued, if the same usage of fossil fuels are continued, and without any preparatory or mitigation steps, then we can easily say that the sixth mass extinction will be due to the Anthropocene or human-induced. By this, we conclude the session. Thank you.